This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
When we look at this bill in its essence, part of the idea around this bill is talking about prevention of a pandemic and future pandemics. Most of these pandemics, of course, are international in origin. And to suggest that we could have a bill here in Canada that could prevent everything that happens around the world, in my mind, is a bit overly ambitious. I guess the other difficulty that I would have with this is my understanding that the individual who has presented this bill really hasn't been very actively engaged in promoting it or trying to make it something useful. And when we look at the goal of a government to, in a future public health emergency, is to reduce the spread, to mitigate damage, and protect the public, that to suggest that a bill that we have here would be able to prevent a global catastrophe, much of what we have seen here in the last 3 years, as I said, is perhaps aspirational in nature, but very much overly ambitious and unrealistic in its scope. Therefore, and also I would suggest that the other parts of this bill are very jurisdictional in nature, and with their inability to influence provincial governments really is kind of nonsensical. That being said, a bill that would suggest that the government of Canada can control the actions of the entire world really seems nonsensical to me. And therefore, continuing down the road of having discussions when we have other significant and perhaps more significant things to discuss, when the Liberal government has chosen not to have a pandemic inquiry, and it would appear by this bill that the Liberal government doesn't wish to have a pandemic inquiry, that they would be satisfied having a private member's bill suffice for all Canadians to be the inquiry with respect to a pandemic. And from my perspective, when we look at this, Chair, it would seem something that is incredibly short in its ability to provide what Canadians are looking for. The pandemic realistically took a significant toll on Canadians with their ability to provide for themselves, with their ability to access medical care, with their ability to continue their businesses. And of course, since the time of the pandemic, what have we seen? We have seen 40-year highs of inflation, Mr. Chair. We have seen escalating interest rates at the hands of this Liberal government because of the money that they printed. And part of the original issue when we came to this bill, witnesses presented by the Conservative Party were also those who would have spoken on behalf of Canadians in terms of the cost of living crisis that the printing of money has since caused. They would have also talked about the banking system. They would have also spoke very clearly about the mental health effects that happened to children, that perhaps there were more issues related to mask wearing than not, and are these things going to be an essential part of moving forward? We also would have called witnesses related to the issues
order,
around.
Mr. Chair?
What
Yes,
is up with this
Mr.
guy
Davies
today?
on a point of order.
Thank you. Maybe Dr. Ellis could turn off his mic before he makes snide comments. My point of order is the issue that we're debating is the purpose of the Act, which says the purpose of this Act is to prevent the risk of and prepare for future pandemics and to promote transparency and accountability, etc. And the Conservative motion, which is moved ironically by the Conservatives and by Dr. Ellis, is simply to change the words to prevent the risk of, to reduce as much as possible the risk of. As you said at the beginning of this, Mr. Chair, in moving a motion to amend the bill, we are to speak briefly to the amendment. And what Dr. Ellis is doing is meandering onto all sorts of completely unrelated subjects, including the economy, when the only purpose of his own amendment is to change the words prevent the risk of to reduce as much as possible the risk of. So I would just ask that if he wanted to talk about these other subjects, it was entirely open to him to amend the purpose of the act to talk about the economy and all sorts of other things. He did not do that. So I would call on him as my point of order to have him speak to his amendment and to restrict his comments to the reasoning for his amendment and any related facts to that instead of a meandering subject of the pandemic in general.
Thank you, Mr. Davies. Point of order with respect to relevance and repetition is a valid point of order. As I said before, there's a pretty wide latitude in the chair with respect to relevance. Dr. Ellis is clearly testing the outer limits of that. But with that advice, I'll ask him to retake the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I guess meandering is an interesting word that my colleague wishes to use when we're talking about a pandemic that happened only once in 100 years and had extremely wide-reaching effects across all segments of Canadian society. And certainly there have been multiple Conservative Party amendments put forward, 20 or so on a bill that is incredibly wide-ranging and had, and I think the relevance, Chair, is really related to the fact that it is important, exceedingly important, to underscore the impacts that this pandemic had on Canadians. And for one, as I began to say before there was a point of order, what I was suggesting was that there is this Liberal and NDP coalition government really ready to have a pandemic inquiry based on a private member's bill? Is that realistically the kind of shield that they wish to hide themselves behind when we know very clearly that part of the goal of...
Yes, Mr. Davies, on the point of order.
Dr. Ellis is clearly outside the relevance of this issue because it is not permissible in this committee to allow a member to talk about all sorts of irrelevant issues beyond their own amendment. And I would ask that you call Dr. Ellis to order, have him wrap up his comments, we can vote on this section and move forward on this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Davies. I've tried. Mr. Majumdar, please.
To describe the Conservative effort to place opioids and economic recovery, as Dr. Ellis has been passionately describing as a filibuster, is, I think, irresponsible because at the end of the day, I mean, Mr. Davies is protecting his NDP Liberal friends and cover-up as opposed to actually pursuing a genuine, comprehensive review of a pandemic.
So if we don't get the wording of the purpose of this bill appropriate from the very beginning, then I would suggest to this committee that if we talk about the word preventing a pandemic versus reducing the likelihood of a pandemic, that there would be a significant problem as to how many of these measures could potentially be brought forward in an incredibly draconian way, especially when we know that the significant idea the significant idea that is brought forward by this Liberal government, which we saw during the heydays, if I can use that word, of the pandemic, were realistically related to the need to divide Canadians and to call them names such as misogynistic and racist. And when those divisions are sowed, I would suggest to you that there is significant and considerable hurt feelings that exist amongst many, many Canadians in all different parts of this country. So for my honourable colleague to suggest that getting the wording around prevention versus reducing the likelihood of future pandemics on a worldwide basis would be absolutely essential to how we move forward with respect to this bill. And when we begin to look at reducing the likelihood, again, it can't be underscored enough, Chair, to really be very, very clear with the need to say to people, what is the freedom that you have as a Canadian? What is your personal choice when you begin to understand that if we're talking about prevention of a particular illness versus reducing the likelihood therein? You know, for instance, if we were going to prevent illnesses, maybe we should just lock everybody up at home and make them stay there and give them significant amounts of government money. Oh, well, wait a minute, we already tried that, and when we tried that, we know that printing money flooded the economy and caused this significant high, 40-year inflation high that we now have with interest rates set by the Bank of Canada at 5%.
Dr. Pawlowski, please.
Well, it certainly came with a lot of unnecessary window dressing, but let me actually confine my remarks to the amendment itself. And in the spirit of collegiality and brevity, which has thus far marked the proceedings, I would actually say I agree with Dr. Ellis. And I would like to, however, add a little something because yeah, it'll be pretty short because it may be the only time. No, it's not the carbon tax, but it's the one time I get the floor. And so I have to say, because I know we all know what's going on here, but when this bill first came forward, I too had real reservations about it. In that, come on, and some of us, a lot of us, were part of the COVID committee that sat through COVID. There was a lot of discussions. There's a lot of things that were relevant. And to do this and address this in a PMB seemed a bit much. No, not a bit much, a lot much. However, I've come to change my mind about it because what this bill does is fundamentally require the government to come up with the pandemic preparedness plan and to make that public. Now, yes, it's going through, as a PMB, it kind of circumvents the normal process, but it's going to get out there and we're going to know what plan exists. And you and the opposition will have a chance to reply to that plan.
Mr. General, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And not to belabor the point, but I appreciate what Mr. Pawlowski brought up and do want to say this in the context that understand of NDP 1 amendment looking at the inquiry, but being as that this is the first clause of the beginning of the bill that we're looking at, addressing just that fact. I haven't been convinced, as Mr. Pawlowski has been, but what we went through during the pandemic, and there are many people around the table, Ms. Sadu, Mr. Pawlowski, Mr. Theriault, Mr. Davies, myself, when we were told consistently over and over again that this is what we're doing now, but don't worry, there will be a plan, there will be an inquiry. So again, knowing that we're going to move on to Don's amendment soon to vote on, I just want to raise it now before we get too far into the bill at the purpose level that having a private members bill address this was certainly, I don't think, the intent of the people around the table. Sorry, I forgot about Mr. Fisher. Of course, he was there too. It wasn't the intent that we heard, particularly in opposition, that this is how things were going to be addressed. And I think there's a lot of good faith at the time, Mr. Chair, that there was going to be something more substantial. And what I really, really worry about is that the government won't bring forward something now knowing that they have this to be able to point to. And we've already seen that with the minister pointing to this during some of the testimony that, you should say the previous minister, during some of his testimony saying that there's no need to talk about the pandemic because this is coming forward. So, you know, I won't belabor the point, but just wanted to state it at the outset that this alone, a private members bill, is, you know, I know Nate's probably listening in on the webcast, and you know, he's a good friend, and you know, this isn't personal, but ultimately, you know, at the end of the day, this isn't what I think not only us as opposition were sold in good faith, but also the general public.
Mr. Davies?
Thank you. Well, on the narrow issue of the amendment, I support it, and I think, frankly, all that needed to be said was the explanation of why it's better wording to describe the purpose. My narrow point would be
Point of order, Chair.
Dr. Ellis, on a point of order?
I think the chair has been very clear that we wish members to be brief. And you know what? Having heard my own self-talk for a very long time, Chair, I would suggest that is this member really going to add something? If he's going to vote for the motion anyway, maybe he could just not say anything, and that would be nice and brief.
Not a point of order, not helpful. Mr. Davies, please.
Thank you. The irony of a speaker who just took the better part of an hour speaking, interrupting someone after 30 seconds is breathtaking. But on the purpose of this, it says the reason I support the amendment is because the current language says the purpose of the act is to prevent the risk of a future pandemic. I don't actually think you can prevent the risk. I think the language that's been proposed is good because it says the purpose of the act is to reduce as much as possible the risk. And I think that's actually aligned with reality. I don't think you can ever prevent a risk, but you can reduce it. And that's why I think that it's a good amendment, and I plan on supporting it.
The speakers list, like your chair, is exhausted. So are we ready for the question? Shall CPC 1 carried? Shall it carry? Yes. All those, I see unanimity around the table.